Good morning, or depending on when you're watching this, good afternoon or good evening. I'm going to walk through the uh, purchase agreement, and this is a draft copy. It's not related to any property you're interested in writing an offer or looking at, and just kind of give you a brief rundown or summary of the different pages in here so you're a little more familiar. You will get a PDF or I've already sent you a PDF copy of the purchase agreement for you to review before signing. So if you want to print that out and put it side by side with this, you can, or just follow along on the screen. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to scroll down to page 7 where the actual purchase agreement is. The first couple of documents are some disclosure documents, which we can talk about a little bit later. But I don't want this to be super long, so we're going to move down to the purchase agreement. This first page of the document is going to contain the name of the buyer, identify the property, the price, the length of escrow, the amount of deposit that needs to go into escrow, how much money is being borrowed, and how much needs to be brought in at the end of escrow, and how much needs to be brought into escrow at closing. So we'll start at the top. The date prepared is the reference date of the contract. Anytime there's counteroffers or other documents, it always refers back to the purchase agreement dated, and that date is the date prepared. Then your information, your name or names will be put on the buyer line, the address, city, state, zip, and the assessor's parcel number to identify the property that you're purchasing. The price of what you're offering goes in the next line here, and then below that is the close of escrow. This date is pretty fluid. It ends up being when the offers go out more a reference date because it gets negotiated out between you and the seller exactly the amount of time. And we're seeing escrow times range from 21 to 45 days. They can go up to 60 days, but typically 30 to 45 are probably the most popular. But some buyers in this heated market that have really good lenders can get these things done in about 21 days. So you could see a shorter time frame. And this is strictly up to an agreement between buyer and seller and usually gets hammered out with counteroffers on terms. The agency is going to have the agents who are involved, who are representing the buyer and the seller. After that, the financing terms come up. So the first thing is this initial deposit. We call it the earnest money deposit. This is your money. This money counts towards the purchase of the property, but it's what we also call your risk money. And so typically we're seeing deposits anywhere of 3% of the purchase price to $10,000 are being included with the offer to open up escrow. This money, why I call it your risk money, is that as your investigation periods on this purchase expire, this money becomes at risk. And we'll go over that as we get to that section in the contract. This money can be delivered to escrow a number of ways: personal check, wire, cashier's check, and this goes to escrow. It does not go to the seller. The escrow company is a third party. It's I call them Switzerland because they work on behalf of both buyer and seller equally. They don't take sides. And they hold the money until they get instructions from both buyer and seller as to what to do with the money. Typically, we don't see increased deposits that much. Sometimes we do, depending on the property, but we're probably won't see one on a transaction like we're working on now. The first loan, or we don't see a lot of first and seconds like we did in the old days, but you're going to get a loan for the property, and let's just say if you were going to put $100,000 down into the property cash and you wanted to borrow $400,000, this is how we see it. So you've got your $10,000 deposit, you're borrowing $400,000, and before escrow closes, you're going to need to come in with the additional $90,000 to equal the $500,000 total. In the money that you borrow, we typically put in an interest rate and points. And so this is the maximum interest rate. So say we're in escrow and rates change and they go up over 4%. You do have the potential to cancel the purchase if you believe the interest rate is too high based on what number we put in this field, and you can get your deposit back. And there's another section where I can show you how this all comes into play. This buyer shall pay points not to exceed. The lender is going to charge. They can't charge you more than 1% fee to do the loan. Then there's going to be no secondary financing. Again, we don't see seconds being done too often anymore. And we're not doing FHA VA on these unless there was a reason to. If there was, we would fill this out and it would add an additional form for FHA financing and VA. If there were additional financing terms, we could type them out on this line, and the balance of the purchase price shows up, as I explained before, at $90,000 come in at close of escrow to equal the $500,000. You will have some costs to do your loan, and when you speak with your lender, you should get a cost sheet from them on what it's going to cost, your closing costs, because that will be in addition to the $90,000. When we get to the second page, this talks about verification of down payment and closing costs. So when we told you that we're going to need to see proof of funds and a pre-approval letter, this is what we mean. The verification of down payment is your proof of funds. It means if you're going to be bringing 90,000 or 100,000 into it, you're going to have bank statements that show that you have this 90 or $100,000. The lender's going to ask for it. And the seller wants to see this so they know that you can actually put together this loan. And we can help you with that. But again, you're going to be providing this to the lender no matter what. Now, when you speak to your lender, they're going to tell you where this money can come from, and sometimes it can come in the form of a gift from a relative. You may have it all. Sometimes this can be in different types of savings accounts, even retirement, but you need to speak with the lender and if you need to, your tax preparer, depending on where you're going to bring in the money for your down payment and closing costs. The second is an appraisal contingency and removal. So this is standard setup for a 17-day contingency to get an appraiser in and get an appraisal value on the property. If the appraisal comes in at the contract price on this, in this case, $500,000 or $500,000 or higher, then this appraisal contingency pretty much is removed because it's come in at the price. You still need to fill out a form to waive the appraisal contingency. You can also check that it's not contingent, but the risk here is that, let's say the house appraises for $475,000 and your purchase price is $500,000, you would need to bring in the extra $25,000 difference because you wouldn't have an appraisal contingency. And this is something we will discuss at length in putting together your offer. Sometimes there's an advantage on the property to waiving this. If you really want the property and you do have that extra money that you can put in, then maybe you'll want to waive it. But if you don't have the extra money, then we're going to advise you don't want to waive this because of the risk. Loan terms. The loan terms, you're going to have your loan application done. This is why we need a pre-approval done up front, because the contract's already asking that this needs to be done. The sellers need to see that you're pre-approved. You do get a loan contingency. This is another contingency period, just like the appraisal contingency. This contingency automatically is a 21-day in the boilerplate language. Here you can shorten up that time frame. Some lenders can work faster to get your approval. The reason why you would want to shorten up your loan contingency is if there are multiple offers on a property, you want to make your offer stronger, you're going to shorten this up. Typically, you're not going to need more than 21 days to get loan approval, so we generally do not see longer time periods. But I do want to cover something in this loan contingency. The buyer shall act diligently in good faith to obtain designated loans. Buyer's qualification, contingency, or appraisal contingency has been waived or removed, then failure. Buyer shall act diligently and in good faith to obtain designated loans. Buyer's qualification for the loan specified is a contingency of this agreement and otherwise agreed to in writing. If there is no appraisal contingency or the appraisal contingency has been waived or removed, then failure of the property to appraise at the purchase price does not entitle the buyer to exercise cancellation right pursuant to the loan contingency if the buyer is otherwise qualified for the specified loans. Buyer's contractual obligations regarding deposit balance of down payment and closing costs are not contingencies of this agreement. So I want you to understand, we have seen this in the past, is that this last line, buyer's contractual obligations requiring deposit, balance of down payment, and closing costs are not contingencies. So that means that if all of a sudden you get your statement near the end of closing, and let's say for whatever reason your fees go up $2,000 to get your closing costs settled with the bank, you cannot cancel because those closing cost fees went up. If something happens where you can't bring in your deposit, you can't cancel as a contingency of this contract. So this is really important for people to understand. And then below it just says, after acceptance, buyer has specified in paragraph 14 in writing to remove the loan contingency or cancel this agreement. That's 21 days. If there's an appraisal contingency, removal of the loan contingency shall not be deemed removal of the appraisal contingency. If you're selling a property, then this box is going to be checked, and it's going to make this whole purchase contingent on you selling your other property, or selling your property, I should say. These are the addenda and advisories that we generally give out on most transactions. In this, you'll see we have a Keller Williams addendum that has a lot of local information about things that are important to East Ventura County, if the property's in East Ventura County. The West San Fernando Valley, Simi Valley, those areas, Thousand Oaks, Conejo Valley. There's a buyer's inspection advisory that warns you to do your due diligence to bring in the people you need to satisfy yourself with the condition of the house. There will be the statewide buyer advisory. This should be checked off. It's a big long form that pretty much covers everything in the state of California that people should be concerned with buying property. It's a pretty lengthy document. For example, it covers all kinds of properties. Say you buy a house next to a golf course, it warns you that you could get golf balls in your backyard from people playing golf. So after you move in, you can't call up everyone and go, hey, I'm getting golf balls in my yard, because they'll say, well, we sent you the advisory, and it explains, you buy properties like that. These are some of the issues you have to deal with. In the other terms, we're representing you as the buyer. And as the buyer, we have a $325 fee to be paid to our company. The agents, myself and my team, the way we are compensated through this is indirectly. The sellers agreed to pay the listing agent a commission, and part of the MLS agreement, the listing agent has agreed to share part of that commission with us as finding and bringing the buyer to the property. So directly you're paying the $325, and indirectly through the purchase price we're being compensated out of the commission. Then under 7 you got the allocation of costs, inspections, reports, certificates. This is where there's some closing costs involved. Most of this falls on the seller side, and we'll kind of walk through this really quick. Number 1, there's a natural hazard zone report that the seller is required by the state to give the buyer. These reports generally run about $100. Again, it's a cost to the seller typically, and it explains where earthquake, flood, and fire hazards are within 1 mile of the property. There's other information in there, a lot of times regarding the property tax, the environmental issues, any of those that you get in a report as a buyer to review. And this is one of those disclosures that if you read something in that report that doesn't make you comfortable, you're able to back out in your investigations period and get your deposit back. The other thing is that the seller under B, so you're going to see under government requirements in retrofit. Depending on where the property is, Los Angeles City is different from Ventura County. Ventura County, you're required to have smoke detectors, carbon monoxide detectors, water heater bracing, and they all have to be working properly. You cannot have old expired smoke detectors, so even though if they still beep and work, if they're more than 10 years old, they need to be replaced. If you're in Los Angeles County, there is a very big laundry list of retrofit requirements, and as we represent you as a buyer, we'll make sure that these items are handled with contract language here, so the seller makes sure all those retrofit requirements are taken care of. The buyer and seller are going to split the escrow fee. They've got each have their own escrow fee from the escrow company. We can put together kind of a summary document separate from this, but you'll still need to verify with your lender because the lender will have some fees in there that will impact that as well. Typically in these negotiations, the seller and the seller's agent like to use their escrow and their title, but this is all a negotiation. This is all has to be agreed to by the buyer. And that's just because they're familiar with those companies and what they'll do for them. As a buyer, especially in a heated, hot market like this, if you want to make your offer more attractive, if the seller give the seller their choice of escrow company, they're all pretty darn close in terms of costs. We don't see a huge fluctuation in the cost between these escrow fees unless we get an escrow request that we've had complaints from that escrow company, then we'll try and figure out how to come up with a different solution that'll work for everybody. Again, in Southern California, typically the seller is being asked to provide the owner's title insurance policy. Here's the reason why. The seller is going to guarantee that the title they are transferring to you is free and clear, that they have proper ownership and they're giving you proper ownership to the property. And they're backing up that statement by purchasing a title insurance policy. So in case there was some defect in title that came up down the road, you are protected. In Northern California, the sellers are forcing the buyers to pay for this, which, in my opinion, this is just an opinion, is a little backwards because it's the seller's title. Do they have clear title? Do they have clean title? They need to show us that they have clean title. It's not our job to prove that they have clean title. It's their job, and they need to back that up with a policy. We're letting the seller pick the title company for the insurance policy. I've seen the rate sheets. They're all within very close each other, $50, $75 in the policy. It's not a big number. The seller in Ventura County pays a transfer tax fee. That's a transfer tax on the deed. In Los Angeles, the city adds an additional fee where you see that seller to pay the city transfer tax fee. That's a big number. So that's important that the seller takes care of these on this transfer. If there's an HOA involved, these next three items are important. The seller is going to pay a transfer fee. Also, we'll check off number 5 that they'll pay the dock fees, and those can be for a seller about $300 or $400 up front. I've seen, I think $500 was the highest I've ever seen. Number 6, the seller's going to pay for a cert fee, or buyer's going to pay for a certification fee. So sometimes there's a certification fee. We have to talk to the lender on that and the HOA if that's required to get that figure. The seller's going to deliver a big package of documents to you. This package of documents is going to be HOA financials, HOA meeting notes and minutes, and the rules and regs for you to review. And this is a contingency. This is part of your investigation. There are no private transfer fees. If there were other things we needed to pay for, the buyer needed to pay for, we can put them on these lines. This number I've got here for $690 on a home warranty is high for, say, a condominium townhome, but for a house, this is pretty average what we're seeing now. Sellers usually will pay a home warranty, and that's because if they sell you the house and they move out and something happens with the dishwasher or whatever, then you can call the home warranty company and it doesn't become a big dog fight between buyer and seller. Did the seller disclose there was a problem with the dishwasher, et cetera, et cetera. Just sometimes things happen. Everything's working fine. You move in 3 days later, the garbage disposal stops working. It's not a seller, typically not something the seller hid. It just is part of life. Things have certain time frame, and so that's why we ask for these home warranties. Okay, so now the rest of this is going to go a little quicker, and we kind of move into, after this page, into more things about disclosure responsibilities and investigation time periods. So under 8, there's items that are going to be included or excluded from the sale. In most cases, there's really not a lot of items. If you want to ask for the stove, the refrigerator, the washer and dryer, you can ask for these things. The stove typically conveys or goes with the property. Refrigerators and washer and dryers are usually a negotiation point in all of these contracts. So it's important to understand that we can ask for things. It doesn't mean we always get it. 99.9% of the time I've seen the stove stay. I've never really seen a seller want to take the stove with them. Dishwasher is built in, that stays if it's in the house, but these refrigerator, washer, dryer, they're all considered more personal property, so that's why these need to be checked off and included. If you want them, a lot of people like to buy new when they get into their house and have newer appliances, so that's going to be up to a negotiation between us with the seller. There could be other things like security systems, water softeners, maybe there's solar system, comes with the house. So all of that has to be hashed out as to what needs to stay or go. Typically, the alarm companies just cancel the service and leave the equipment in the house because they're hoping to come back and resell you at some time to start up the service, and then they don't have to reinstall all the hardware. Items excluded. So if there was something, like a shed in the backyard that you didn't want on a house with a backyard, or there was just something that you didn't want, say you didn't want the refrigerator, you could check those off. If you look at this right here, unless otherwise specified, things like audio, video components, flat screen TVs, even the bracket attached to the wall. You could get into a big argument over leave this, don't leave that. I just say it's better to just assume that between audio, visual, TVs and stuff, it's all going with the seller unless we specify, hey, I really want this. Closing in possession. So a lot of sellers need a day or two after escrow closes to get out. It's just the way we see it. So the seller may say, hey, I need 2 days after the close of escrow to move out of the property. And that'll just be part of the negotiation that goes in here under 9. If this was not going to be occupied as the primary residence, it would be checked off here. That does have some consequences on loans. So, you got to talk to your lender as to exactly how you're taking this property. We get into the next page, seller to remain in possession after close. This is really important. Sellers are always saying, hey, I need extra time. I need a month here. I got to stay here to find another place or move into another place. And that's all fine. We can negotiate those out. The seller remain in possession means the seller needs 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 2 days, 2 months to stay at the house after the close of escrow. This pretty much makes the seller a tenant in the property. The seller has a responsibility to make sure that they're watering the landscaping, maintaining the landscaping, not damaging the property. And so there's a lot of responsibility by staying in the property from the seller. And as the buyer, you become what I'd say a quasi, or you are the landlord while they're in there. And so there are some risks as to leaving the seller to remain in possession. These are done all the time. They typically go pretty well, but we can't guarantee that every time it's going to go perfectly. So this is going to be something that we really need to talk about if the seller is going to stay on the property after it closes, and how you need to handle it. If this is tenant occupied property, which this is a whole different ballgame if you're buying a house with a tenant in it, we're going to assume in this transaction that there's no tenant occupied property. You can just read through this, letter E, letter F, about close of escrow, password, seller to provide keys, passwords, codes to all locks, security systems, anything they leave behind. Then there's the statutory disclosures. So the seller's going to have to give us forms that talk about everything under this section here in 10. It has everything to do from lead-based paint to, they have a couple of transfer disclosure, a seller property questionnaire, again, the hazards report. You get all of this to review and decide whether you want to move forward with the purchase or cancel the purchase, back out, and keep your deposit. Also, we will do what's called a visual inspection. So we walk through and tell you the condition of the property. We're not invasive like a home inspector. We're not doing an in-depth inspection like a home inspector does. We do basically a visual. We walk through and scan the rooms to see and look for things that are obvious. We don't open walls, climb under houses, in attics, none of that type of stuff. That, again, that's for a home inspector. And then it notes in 3 here, sellers can't and buyers can't just agree to waive certain statutory disclosures. The lead-based paint disclosure is really important. Properties built before 78 could probably or possibility have lead-based paint. So buyer and seller can't say, oh, well, we're just going to waive this disclosure because we don't care, as it's required by law. Under 4, the seller, most of the time, 99.9% of the time, is required to give a TDS, seller property questionnaire. So TDS is transfer disclosure statement, seller property questionnaire. The seller answers all the questions about the condition of the property on those 2 forms. Times that you're going to see sellers not required is that, maybe it's an entity that owns the property, but for the most part, the seller is going to be filling this out. The seller's got to get us all this documentation. So even though if we have a inspection time period, let's say we have a very short inspection time period of 7 days. Say there's such a hot market that you want to try and get in this property and you want to shorten your inspection period so the seller sees your offer is more attractive. They've got to give you all of these documents that are in this form that are required. They have to disclose what they know about the property. So if they forget to do that or they don't do it in a timely manner, you cannot waive your inspections on things they haven't given you. You've waived all your inspections and all of a sudden they say, oh, we forgot to tell you about X, Y, and Z. I'll show you later on in the contract that once they drop that new information on you, you get an additional 5 days to consider that information, decide whether you want to cancel and take your deposit or move forward. There's natural environment and hazards disclosure. There's a booklet, talks about, all the different things, whether it's earthquake or chemical issues or environmental issues around owning a home. The NHD reports will show, special flood hazard areas typically. So you'll get all of that information. Withholding taxes, if you're buying a rental property, this is an important paragraph, and we will help you through that as well as escrow. Megan's Law database disclosure, this just tells you where the website is, and if you want to look up in the neighborhood where, all the people on this database are, you can go to this website here and do that. The other thing is, I don't know if you remember, a number of years ago, a big gas pipeline blew up in, I think it was San Jose area. And so now you can go to this website to see if there's some of these liquid transmission pipelines and gas pipelines in your area where you're buying the property. Number F, or letter F, it's condominium plan development disclosures. So the seller is given 7 days to get you all these condominium documents, but the HOA and the property management companies move much slower. So again, if it takes the management company 10 days to get you the documents on the HOA, you can't waive that contingency. So if that gets dropped on you at 10 days, you still get some time to review that. Then we'll go on to the next page. This is more of these condominium plan development disclosures, talks about in this paragraph, condition of the property. So every property sold pretty much across the United States, if you look at the contract language, it always says as is in its present condition. So you're buying the property as is, as you see it. However, you bring in an inspector or home inspection company or contractors or whoever you want to look at the condition of the property to see if you're satisfied with it. So what this means to the seller is the buyer gets to decide whether this as-is condition is acceptable. And that goes for you, the buyer. You get to figure this out. Am I okay? The seller's required to disclose, and you'll see it right here under A, any known material facts or defects affecting the property. So they've got to tell you if there's adverse conditions in that property that would affect your desire to buy the property. They need to tell you about this stuff. And if you look down here, it says including known insurance claims in the past 5 years and make any and all other disclosures required by law. So there's a bunch of these that show up throughout the contract, and there's a lot of forms to fill out to get this. But again, the main responsibility of the seller is they've got 2 of these forms that are questionnaires that really ask them some pretty in-depth questions about what they know about the property, and they're supposed to get those over to us so we can review them. Again, under 12, you're going to bring in your people to look at the property and satisfy it for yourself. The seller's required to tell you what they know, but they're not always required to bring in people to investigate the property for you. That's on you, the buyer. And this could be anything from pest control, which you'll see pest control reports, to surveys, tests. Some properties, if it's not a condominium or townhome, the buyer will do a sewer inspection where they run a camera down the sewer. They hire a termite company to come look at it. They'll hire a home inspector. We've had buyers bring in air conditioning contractors, electricians when they think they need to do things like that. So you have to do all these investigations, plus read all the reports that you're going to get. The seller shall make the property available. So the seller's going to give us some times where we can get people in. It's really important that we figure out who we want to bring in. And after that initial inspection, do we need any follow-up? And we should do that in a quick and timely manner. First off, so we know and we're not wasting our time. And second, so the seller isn't waiting an eternity for us to make a decision. Okay, really quick under D. So we indemnify the seller as the buyer that if the inspectors come in and damage the property, and I haven't had this happen ever in my career, but I've seen some pictures in some real estate discussion forums where home inspectors have actually stepped through the ceiling when they're up in the attic and things like that, and that would be on us and the inspector to make that right. Trips, falls, all that stuff. We're indemnifying the seller that if our people have problems, that they've created or they've done themselves, the seller is not going to be obligated to make the insurance claim on their insurance. We're going to have to deal with it. And you can just read through here. It talks about protecting the seller from liabilities or any injuries to persons or properties occurring during any buyer's investigations or work done on the property at buyer's direction prior to close of escrow. Then the next thing, we got title investing. I can set you up with a title company if you want to decide how to get your vesting on the property, because that will be a question as to if you want to be tenants and common, single, sole and separate property. There's a lot of questions on that in our escrow. Our title representatives would be happy to go over that with you. That you're taking the title in its present condition. We will get a preliminary title report to review, so you can review any of those issues. Again, it keeps coming up that the seller's got to disclose to the buyer all matters known to the seller affecting title, whether recorded or not. So anything, or if there's a problem with, the neighbor claiming that there's a dispute over the property line, and it's this buyer, the seller and the neighbor know about this dispute, but the seller doesn't tell you about this. These are things that would affect the title of the property. The seller has a duty to disclose to you. Under D, this will explain a close of escrow, what you're going to receive, and some of the considerations you need when you take title and issues that could affect you either legally or through taxes. We earlier talked about the title insurance policy and why it's important for the seller to get this and why the seller's typically paying for it here in Southern California. Under 14, this is one of your contingency periods, so this is really important. This is under 14, this is the seller's got to get you everything they are required to in 7 days. Again, as I explained earlier, the HOA documents are really hostage to how fast the property management company gets it to us. But the other seller documents come pretty quickly, usually within these 7 days. Between escrow and our team here, we are really good at getting this stuff out as quickly as we can for our sellers, and we're good at retrieving it for our buyers. The only obstacle is retrieving it as a buyer's agent is if the seller's agents are not working as efficiently as we are. You, as the buyer, have 17 days to review this under the contract. It's set at 17. Now, you can shorten that time frame, and the reason why we may advise you to shorten the time frame is, say there's 10 offers, you're one of 10 offers on a property. If we can tell the seller, hey, you get us all the information, we're going to get these investigations done in 7 days or 10 days, that will make your offer look more attractive to the seller. Otherwise, outside of this 17 days, so this covers everything to do with your physical investigations on the property, reviewing any disclosures or documents, doing any type of investigation about the neighborhood or the area. You get this time period to do this, and if you come to us and you say, I don't like the property because of X, Y, and Z, I really want to back out of this transaction, under this time period, and this 14B1, we can cancel, and we do not have to give the seller any reason why we're canceling and get the money back. This is something really almost unique to most of the country in California. It gives the buyer a lot of power and advantage because if they want to get out, they're allowed to just get out under this 14B, and there's not a whole lot of discussion as to why or why not they get to go. So we'll probably go back over this again several times. Your contingencies are on your getting the appraisal, getting your loan approval, and doing all your investigations of the property. There's 3 different contingency points where you're able to cancel the transaction. So by the end of the time specified in paragraph 14B1, or as otherwise specified in the agreement, the buyer shall deliver the seller a removal of the applicable contingencies. So this has to be done in writing. It cannot be done without a form signed in writing. We will discuss this with you as the buyer and make sure you understand when you're waiving contingencies, how that affects your deposit. But it does say right here, however, if any report, disclosure, or information for which the seller is responsible is not delivered within the time frame above, then the buyer has 5 days after the delivery of any such item or item specified in paragraph 14B, whichever is later, to deliver the seller removal contingency applicable with cancellation of this contract or cancellation of this contract. So real briefly is that, let's say that we agree to 7 days to get all our investigations, review all the reports and everything. Let's just say on day 3, the seller gives us new information. You have a total of 5 days. So even though we agreed to 7 days, we changed out this 17 to 7 days. On day 3, 5 days would put us to really 8 days. So the seller really, this is important as a seller. The seller can't just sit on information and then drop it on the buyer at the last minute, and the buyer doesn't get a lot of time to look at it. If it's new information, if it was information the seller was required to give the buyer, we get 5 days from the day it was given to us, irregardless of what the time frame we've agreed to up here. Okay, so under 4, continuation contingency, even at the end of the time period specified in 14B and before seller cancels if at all, pursuant to paragraph 14B, buyer retains the right in writing to either remove remaining contingencies or cancel this agreement based on a remaining contingency. Once buyer's written removal of all contingencies is delivered to the seller, seller may not cancel this paragraph pursuant to paragraph 14D1. So the seller, once you remove all your contingencies as the buyer, the seller just can't arbitrarily run around and try and cancel this agreement. And so we'd have to go to paragraph D to determine what the seller's cancellation's right, if they have any, or they could be obligated to sell the house. The way we deal with these contingency time periods for the buyer or the seller are through what's called a notice of buyer or notice of seller to perform. So if you're dragging your feet as a buyer on your investigations and we've received all the information we need to receive from the seller and you're just dragging your feet and won't waive the contingency, the seller's only remedy is they would issue a notice for buyer to perform, which is a 2-day notice. So we would be given an additional 2 days to cancel out the contract or waive the contingencies and move forward. The seller does not get the right to keep the deposit under this notice of buyer to perform. If let's just say they are noticing us to waive our inspection contingency. If we don't waive it in the 2 days, they can cancel the contract, but your deposit would come back to you, would be an example. There is a notice of seller to perform, and that is if you've removed all your contingencies and we're trying to close and the seller starts to hold a closing, we can demand to close escrow, notice the seller to perform. There's a number of ways we can issue a notice for the seller to perform, and they would have 2 days to get us what we need or to close the escrow, etc., or we would have a right to cancel as the buyer. You need to be aware of everything in the contract, but even under Section F, when you start removing these contingencies, that earnest money deposit on page 1, that $10,000, becomes at risk. And once you waive all your contingencies, that risk money is up. It's very hard to get back because that is the risk money, as we explained before. If you do something to breach the contract that you have no rights to breach it under, you could lose that $10,000 to the seller. Close of escrow. Before the buyer or seller may cancel the agreement for failure of the other party to close escrow pursuant to this agreement, buyer or seller must first deliver the other party a demand to close escrow. This demand to close escrow is a 3-day notice. So this adds another 3 days to get this going. That way the seller can't just cancel out on a buyer in 24 hours, take their money. At least the buyer's got time to get whatever they need to get done to get the escrow closed. Same with the seller. This talks about the effect on deposits, which we already talked about. And we're going to get into that on this next page. Before that, the final verification of condition. So we got about 5 days prior to close of escrow. It could be 3 days, could be a little more depending on everyone's calendar. We get to walk through and make sure the property is substantially in the same condition it was when we made the offer, that we don't find damage or other things that the seller could have done to the property during escrow. Then repairs, just so you know, seller's not obligated to do any repairs to their property. This is a negotiation standpoint. So if we do investigations or we see something on our own or we have an inspector call something out, you can ask the seller for the repairs and we have a form and a process to go through that, but it doesn't mean that we get repairs. Additionally, if the seller does agree to do the repairs or do any repairs on the property, they shall be completed prior to the final verification of the condition unless everyone agrees differently. So let's just say that the seller had to add some GFI outlets in the kitchen or bathroom, or they had to do some sort of like termite repairs or just any type of minor repair, or even if it was a major repair that was agreed the seller was going to do it, at our walkthrough we would verify that all of that was done. Prorations, uh, when escrow closes, it generally doesn't close on the first day or the last day of the month, and so things like the responsibility of property taxes, HOA dues, things like that get prorated out for how much of the month the buyer is living in the house and how much of the month the seller's living in the house. Those types of fees get prorated out. Escrow handles all of those prorations, and you will get that on a statement. Broker's compensation, as I explained earlier, um, the seller, the listing agent, and the seller have agreed to a commission rate. Through the MLS, the listing agent has agreed to compensate us, the buyer's agent. So that's going to be in a separate agreement. Um, and that agreement or those fees are not negotiated out in this purchase agreement. If you're not sure how that works or wants to know a little bit more, just we can discuss that either via email or by phone, how we end up getting paid through the compensation under brokers. And then this discusses our scope of duty and what we need to do for you and what we are not responsible. I mean, for example, we're not responsible for inspecting public records or permits for the property. That's something you have to do on your own. Verifying square footage. This is why you hire home inspectors and appraisers and everyone else to get this information for you to make sure you're satisfied with it. Representative capacity has to do with if your property is held in a trust, or if we were dealing with, say, a company that owned a property and they were a landlord and they held it in a company name, we would get a document that would explain who the signing parties are for the trust or the limited liability corporation or as such. Generally, when you're just working as individuals, this paragraph doesn't come into play. We have the joint escrow instructions to the escrow holder. This gives the escrow holder their duties under the contract. We'll also get additional information from the escrow company that will outline this purchase agreement and their duties and responsibilities. This also says we've got to get all the documents over within 3 days after acceptance. We do this really quick, generally within 24 hours or sooner, depending on, as long as it's not a big holiday or something. We'll come down here. So remedies for buyer's breach of contract. Any clause added by the parties specifying remedies such as release or forfeiture of deposit and making deposit non-refundable for failure of buyer to complete purchase in violation of this agreement shall be invalid unless the clause independently satisfies the statutory liquidated requirements set forth by civil code. And then the next thing is liquidated damages. If you read through it, if buyer fails to complete this purchase because of buyer's default, seller shall retain as liquidated damages the deposits actually paid. If the property dwelling is no more than 4 units, one of which the buyer intends to occupy, then the amount retained shall be no more than 3% of the purchase price. Any excess shall be returned to the buyer except for as provided in 14H. Release of funds will require mutual signed release instructions from both buyer and seller, judicial decision or arbitration award. At the time of any increased deposit, buyer and seller shall sign a separate liquidated damages provision incorporating the increased deposit as liquidated damages. So basically, whatever your initial deposit is, like in this contract is $10,000, or up to 3% of the purchase price. So that'd be $15,000 if it was a 3% of $500,000. That would be the max in liquidated damages. So this is only if you do something catastrophic to break this contract, independent of any of your rights to cancel under a contingency. These contracts all come with a mediation clause and arbitration of disputes. And so you agree to go to mediation on this situation where if the deposit is at dispute, let's just say that you're trying to cancel the contract, the seller and the buyer cannot agree and the seller wants to try and retain the deposit under liquidated damages, you believe that you're not bound by liquidated damage to get your deposit back, or other issues related to the contract, it would first resort to a mediation and then go to arbitration. And that would be just hiring a company. There'd be a mediation company that would come in to try and settle this thing out between the two parties. Again, all of this stuff here, you need to get advice from a legal. I'm not giving legal advice. I'm just hitting the paragraph so you can see what some of these things are. But in terms of being legal advice, this is not legal advice. This is just kind of reading through the contract so you can get familiar with it. The other thing too is when there's a dispute, the escrow company cannot release your deposit to the seller. There's going to have to be a mutually signed instruction from both parties. As we get down past the mediation arbitration, we've got selection of service providers. We can recommend home inspectors, title companies, escrow companies. You're not obligated to use any of them. We do try to find the best people possible because a lot of our clients don't have any of those services or aren't aware of which services to use. We do know very reputable companies we can recommend. I don't get any bonus or anything by recommending those companies. We just want these things to go smooth. We try and find the most competent people if we do recommend, because we want these things to go smoothly and we don't want problems. Multiple listing service, the information of the sale is all going to be published within the MLS so everyone's aware. Attorney's fees, usually the prevailing party is going to be entitled to reasonable attorney's fees, so people are aware of that. There's some basic things like assignment, not assigning this contract to someone else unless the seller agrees to it. Equal housing, there's no discriminating, don't ask. We won't even go there. Anyone who wants to buy the property, as long as they qualify for the loan and have the money to do it, we don't care who they are. And as we get down here, the other thing, time is of the essence. Again, we shouldn't be dragging our feet. We should be doing things in a timely manner. Seller needs to be doing the same thing. That's how these notice to perform, as I explained earlier, get sent out, is because someone's not working in a timely manner. So, we'll keep you up to date, my team. All of us, we're on top of this, and we've got a great transaction coordinator to keep everything moving in line and on time. Here's some basic definitions. If you needed to get more clarification, whether it's acceptance, days after, days prior. Sometimes these come up when the notice to perform is being issued, so everyone knows exactly, days if it's 3 days after. How does that exactly get calculated? We come here and look at the definitions here. The offers will expire, but even if the offers do expire, the seller still can accept an expired offer, and as long as everyone mutually agrees to move forward with it, then we can move forward on these. It's usually 3 days after the offer is issued that they expire. Sometimes we can move that up or lengthen it depending on what you want to do. This is all personal preference here. In a hot market, generally trying to shorten up the time frame doesn't create any advantage, because if the seller's sitting on 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 offers and one guy says, hey, mine expires in 24 hours and the other ones don't, they might give more notice to the offers that don't expire as quickly. This goes back to this representative capacity. If this was a company or a trust or something buying the property, we click this off. And then on this next page, if the seller accepts the offer, then they all sign down here. If there's a counter offer, then this gets checked and the seller issues a counteroffer. All the counteroffer does is it'll change terms. Maybe it changes the price. Maybe it changes how much money is put in deposit into escrow. And then you as the buyer get to look at those terms the seller gives you, and you can either agree to them or amend them, make them better. This is all part of the negotiation. And all the counteroffer does is one page typically that just changes specific terms in this offer. And this talks about who the real estate brokers are and about the broker compensation. The escrow holder will fill out all of this information once the documents are sent over to escrow. And then we also can get this back from the seller to find out when they presented the offer and if the seller rejects it, to make sure that the offer was presented. And then the last thing is your buyer inspections. This is a boilerplate document that's going to give you a roundabout idea of what you should be concerned with in investigating the property and your duties in these buyer investigations. It's giving you some advice on this. And one last thing is our California Consumer Privacy Advisory. To review that, what we do with your personal information, you need to read through this. That's pretty much the whole document in a nutshell. There are several disclosures that come with it. There's our agency disclosure. This explains how we work either as a buyer's agent, a seller's agent, or if we represent both the buyer and seller. The next page is a fair housing discrimination advisory. And this explains that we can't discriminate on any of these items. We don't care who people are, what they look like, any of that stuff. If they want to buy the property and they qualify for their loan, or they have the money in the bank where they can make the purchase go through, we're happy to sell them the property. So you can read through the fair housing rules here. Possible representation of more than one buyer or seller. My company has over 200 agents, so we could have multiple buyers coming from our brokerage that could be competing with you. And so this explains kind of how this works. It does go over dual agency if we're representing the buyer and the seller, whether it's through our entire brokerage or individually ourselves. This is something to review through. And wire fraud. This is a very important document if you're going to use wire transfers. I warn everyone, do not, if anyone sends you an email to talk to you about how to wire your money, do not answer those emails. Call me immediately. We want to be working directly with the escrow officers with your wire instructions. It's really important, so we make sure the money gets into the right hands.